explained by a pleural effusion, a complete lung collapse or, lung nodules. And the edema that you presume that these infiltrates are should not be of cardiogenic source. Basically means your patient should not be fluid overloaded or an acute left heart failure. Then comes to severity of disease. Anything less than 300 is considered ARDS or acute respiratory distress syndrome. Mild disease is 200 to 300, PO to FiO2 ratio. Moderate is 100 to 200, and severe is any ratio which is less than 100. Next slide, please. So again, it does not matter what your numbers are. At the end of the day, what you have to do is treat your patient. Understand your patient phenotype. Understand not all patients who with that chest x-ray may need mechanical ventilation straight away. Because the problem in COVID-19 is not necessarily ventilation, but oxygenation, at least in the initial stages. And there are multiple non-invasive options that exist for hypoxia. Next slide. Because you don't want your patient looking like this, right? If a patient comes to me looking like this, I probably forget the patient, I'm probably screaming at the resident at that point, like, why did you let it become like this? Next slide. So this is what's called type L disease. So this is a phenotype of disease in which the lung is really only the peripheries of the lung are primarily involved. The cause of hypoxia, and this is what the suspicion is actually dysregulated or dysregulation of pulmonary vasoconstriction, where the lungs aren't working, the capillaries and the arteries in the lung are not working appropriately and are basically sending blood to the wrong areas of the lung. Areas of the lung that are not getting any air are actually getting blood, and parts of the lung that are getting air are not getting blood, right? So usually have some amount of respiratory distress, and usually these people can compensate with large tidal volumes and large respiratory rate. They increase their minute ventilation, and they're usually unaware that they're hypoxic. Ritvik, if you could just please play the slide. So this is what your lung would look like. Multiple ground glass opacities in the peripheral lung zones, and basically the center of the lung, you have large areas of normal lung tissue. Next slide, please. And then you get this, what's called type H disease or high elastance disease, which is more typical of traditional ARDS. You have extensive ground glass opacities and frank consolidation of lung tissue. This is your lung that's actually transitioning or has already reached severe traditional ARDS. This patient will usually be severely hypoxic and hypercarbic, will have severe symptoms, often have altered mental status, may need mechanical ventilation urgently or emergently. And in fact, this patient in this scenario had to be put on ECMO within 24 hours. Ritvik, if you could please play the slide. So as you can see, extensive consolidation with ground glass opacities, especially more predominant in the bilateral lower lobes. And this is more or less traditional of COVID-19 and for that matter, ARDS. Next slide, please. So this is straight up physiology. Just a reminder, blast of the past, subjects you hated. What is normal lung? Normal lung or normal VQ ratio is that for every unit of air that comes into the lung, you get 1 unit of blood. Correct? This is a normal VQ ratio or normal perfusion, ventilation perfusion ratio. What does shunt mean? Shunt basically means blood is going to a part of the lung that has no air. So your V, which stands for ventilation, is 0, and Q, which stands for perfusion, is 1. So in this case, your ratio is 0, right? These patients tend to have thick, heavy lungs that are full of fluid, fibrin, gunk, junk, whatever you want to call it, right? This is what you see when you get bad pneumonia. And dead space is basically what you get when you have pulmonary embolism or clots in your lung, where air is going in. So your ventilation is 1, but there's no blood going to that area. So your Q is 0, which basically means you're getting infinity. This is what you get when you have pulmonary embolism or dead space, when you've got very, very thick, when you have very, very thick lung lining, or your cap alveoli get very thick and you're unable to participate in air exchange. Next slide, please. So then we come to the phenotypes of what's called CARDS, which is COVID ARDS, which is your type L disease, which is low elastance, and that's basically loss of pulmonary arterial vasoconstriction. You have pulmonary microthrombi, blood. You have a lot of dead space basically. So what happens is the patient compensates for this by increasing their minute ventilation. Your VQ mismatch over here is basically tending towards infinity. These patients have severe hypoxia with normal or low PCO2. So these patients are asymptomatic. So you might ask me, why are you asymptomatic with severe hypoxia? And the reason for this is, I'm sure you all remember, that the actual trigger for respiratory distress in the brain is not your PO2, but PCO2, which is what happens when you have severe disease. So they don't even realize that the oxygen levels are low because they're able to compensate and keep their PCO2 levels normal. Only when the brain starts getting hypoxic, then it realizes it's something's missing or something's going on. And that's what these patients then present with later on. So usually the treatment for this is you just give them a lot of oxygen. You prone them to help improve their VQ mismatch. You consider NIV, which is non-invasive ventilation, which what it does is it reduces the amount of work of breathing that they have to do, which actually worsens their disease, causes P-SILI, which basically means patient silly, which means patients in self-induced lung injury, where the patient is working so hard to breathe, they destroy their own lungs. And then we move to type H disease, which is more traditional ARDS physiology, which Dr. Mishra will talk to you about more in detail. But basically, these are the people with recruitable lungs. These are the people you prone, you paralyze, you do recruitment maneuvers. This is the lung physiology that we're used to seeing and dealing with. So most people are comfortable with the traditional type H physiology, but type L is a new thing that we've had to learn with COVID ARDS. Next slide, please. So what are considerations on what type of therapy you're going to put the patient on? Now, of course, infection control is a big indicator. The patient might be having a lot of work of breathing, but if they're going to be spraying aerosol all over the place, and you're exposing your nursing staff, your technicians, your physiotherapy, your doctors to COVID-19, your unit's not going to last very long because then they all have COVID-19 and then you're all stuck. Availability of equipment. What if happens if you only have 1 or 2 high flow machines in your unit? Patient tolerability and mental status. You might want to put your patient on NIV to help them reduce their work of breathing, but they're semi-conscious. That may not necessarily be the best option for them. Expected duration of therapy. If you think they can get away with 12, 24 hours of therapy, non-invasive ventilation may not be a bad idea. But if you need to do it for 2 or 3 days, then maybe non-invasive ventilation may not work. And finally, clinical course and prognosis. How rapidly is a patient deteriorating and what are their underlying conditions? Now, if it's an 80-year-old with lung cancer and with COVID-19, do you really want to put them on a ventilator? Are they ever going, or advanced COPD, right? Or if it's like this patient of ours, 43 or a 44-year-old male who's declining rapidly. 3 hours ago, the guy was on room air. Now he's on like 74% with lungs that look like that. Would you want to give them a trial of non-invasive ventilation, or would you proceed directly to maybe a mechanical ventilator? So these are all things that we have to think about prior to deciding what we want to use. Next slide. What are your options? You can use regular nasal cannula, 1 to 6 liters per minute. All of these patients get prone. They can prone themselves. This is usually what we start out with, mild disease. And usually as soon as the hypoxia gets better, their work of breathing should get better because that's what's actually driving it. Because as long as the hypoxia starts improving, the PCO2 starts to regulate and get normal, and that's okay. A venti mask uses the Venturi effect. For people who've forgotten the Venturi effect, it is any flow causes low blood pressure. So depending on the pure oxygen flow, the rate of the flow, and pulling air in from the atmosphere, you can titrate your FiO2. Around 40 to 60% is what you can deliver in this. But remember, your oxygen delivery rates are still only 10 to 12 liters per minute. Option 3, non-rebreather mask. Something that you put on the face can deliver up to 15 liters of oxygen, but usually tends to become a little uncomfortable. And the problem with any mask is that the patient cannot eat, the patient cannot breathe, it fogs up, and then the patients don't like it and they remove it. And then your patient is sitting at 80% or 70% saturation. High flow nasal oxygen up to 100% FiO2 at up to 60 liters per minute. But then you might say, but Dr. Roy, we only breathe at 5 liters per minute, 6 liters per minute, maximum 10 liters per minute. So why are you giving my patient 60 liters per minute and wasting all that oxygen? Good question. The reason for that is when you're taking an inspiratory breath, the speed at which you're breathing is about 60 liters per minute or 1 liter per second, right? So with this machine already blasting air into your lung, into your nose at that rate, your lung, it reduces the amount of work your lung has to do. All your lung has to do is start the inspiratory process and air just flows into the lung automatically. It's almost like the inspiratory limb of a mechanical ventilator. So it helps cope with the high demand that these patients have during inspiration. This causes a decreased work of breathing, and this much pressure or this much volume of air getting shoved into your nose gives you a mild positive airway pressure effect if your mouth is closed. What all we do again, we prone all our patients if they need any oxygen, right? And this has been one of the revelations with COVID-19. I think that we can actually extend this to most of our other patients as well. Prone, if you think about it, all mammals prone. Your dog sits in a prone position. Your horse is in a prone position. Your alligator runs in a prone position. So this is actually the physiological way that nature has designed our lungs to work. The supine ventilation that humans do is actually a convenience thing for us, right? I think most people when they sleep on their back, they actually snore all over the place. Most people who snore, the moment they turn around, everything gets better. So supine is actually very bad and a non-physiological way of sleeping or lying down. Prone is the way to go. And that's what we see. The moment you're proning yourself, as Dr. Mishra will talk about, you're getting rid of a lot of factors which work against you when you're lying on your back. And because these patients tend to develop so many blood clots, which by itself is a completely another webinar, we give all patients low molecular weight heparin as standard, 1 mg per kg BID. That's for low molecular weight heparin, specifically enoxaparin, for all patients on high flow oxygen and above. And this is because we suspect they're in the L type where they have lots of pulmonary microthrombi and dead space ventilation, and we want to open up as much of their lung as possible and get as much blood into their lungs. Next slide, please. So remember, non-invasive ventilation is still mechanical ventilation. A lot of people forget this. They think, oh, this is non-invasive. It's a ventilator. Your patient is still on a ventilator. You have two options. CPAP, which is called continuous positive airway pressure. Basically, think of it, it's a scuba machine. It's just positive pressure sitting on your face. You open your mouth, air goes in, you still have to breathe out by yourself. It does not help with ventilation. What it does, it helps with increases the pressure in your alveoli and is best for conditions of pulmonary edema or fluid filling in your lungs. Whereas BiPAP or BPAP, the technical term, BiPAP is actually a trade name. BPAP or bi-level positive airway pressure supports both hypoxia with the CPAP component and ventilation with the increasing the pressure as you need to take a breath in. This is what helps reduce your work of breathing, because a machine is now doing with electricity what your lungs had to do earlier. Use it for your exhausted patient, your COPD, your asthma, and your patients post-extubation who may not have a good respiratory drive. Now, if you're going to be using non-invasive, try to avoid using single limb circuits, as these now, once they exhale, they dump it into the atmosphere, aerosol all over the place. You're putting your staff at risk. Try to use dual limb circuits where you have an expiratory limb with HME filters, which basically are bacterial and viral filters, which capture all your aerosol particles and prevent aerosolization. Will there be no aerosolization? No, but it helps significantly reduce your aerosolization. Next slide, please. Medical management. The recovery trial just came out recently. This is a whole new topic, a whole different topic. This is just a quick thing. 6 mg per daily dexamethasone was just proven to have a 5% absolute risk reduction in non-ventilated patients, up to 25% in ventilated patients. Low molecular weight heparin, start at least with 60 milligrams daily, escalate as your oxygen needs increase. Lopinavir, ritonavir has some anecdotal data behind it. It's something we are still using. But this is important here. Good physiotherapy. incentive spirometry, physiotherapy, prone your patient. Good supportive care is the cornerstone of management of COVID-19, whether they're a ventilator or not. Send your D-dimer, LDH, ferritin, CRP, and IL-6 levels early to help detect early cytokine release syndrome. If elevated, at least in India, we consider tocilizumab once at least. Do not overhydrate your patients. Give them so much water that their lungs are now full of water instead of everything else. But at the same time, don't make them hypovolemic where they now have kidney failure. So keep them euvolemic. Use echo, use bedside ultrasound to help guide your therapy. We tried this to keep off the ventilator. The reason for this is you have a 48% 28-day mortality on the ventilator versus 25% if you're able to keep them off the ventilator. And next slide, please. I think this is the end of my topic. Oh no, oh, I have intubation. Yes, that is true. So if you have to intubate your patients, try to avoid an emergency intubation like my medical resident over there gave me in the beginning of the slide. So minimize the time taken to intubation. So preparation is important. Keep your kit ready to go. Do not be a hero and try to do a conscious sedation or awake intubation. Remember, you're staring into this guy's trachea. If you cannot get it in, that's aerosolized COVID particles hitting you in the face. So don't do it. Paralyze your patient. Okay. A. B. The moment you paralyze your patient, his oxygen concentration is going to melt like an ice cube in hell, right? It's just going to go down rapidly. High flow or apneic oxygenation is must. Continue to apneic oxygenate your patient as you're intubating him. This is no time to learn how to intubate your patient. Most experienced officer or person for first pass success, use a video laryngoscope. What this does, it maximizes distance from the mouth, so you're not getting hit in the face with COVID-19 droplets, and it maximizes your first pass success. Be prepared for severe hypotension when you intubate your patient. If need be, I keep a bottle of saline ready to go and a couple of pushes of phenylephrine, which I might have to give the patient if they drop their pressure during intubation. Next slide. And now the patient is on a mechanical ventilator, and I hand off to Dr. Mishra, who will tell you all about mechanical ventilating COVID patients. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roy. That was comprehensive. We've received almost 23 questions so far. I think quite a few of them have been answered during the course of your session. We'll try and address a few more of them towards the end. So up next, we have Dr. Mishra, who has gained a comprehensive and valuable experience in the field of critical care by working in renowned centers across the world. She started her training at JJ Hospital, Mumbai, and then moved to be a fellow in Sri Gangaram Hospital, New Delhi. She has experience as a consultant in intensive care at Kalinga Institute of Medical Sciences, Bhubaneswar, before joining the ECMO Fellowship at the prestigious St. Thomas Hospital, London. In her current role at Manchester Royal Infirmary, she is uniquely positioned to deal with the COVID situation in one of the high volume centers in UK. Her experience and work in many ongoing research and audit projects relating to SARS-CoV-2 infection or COVID-19 provides her with a unique and valuable insight into the pandemic and the vital role of intensive care medicine in it. Thank you for being here with us, Dr. Mishra. Over to you.
Hello. Can you see me?
We can see you, ma'am.
Okay. So you, my slides are being shown. Okay. So hello, everyone. I'll be speaking about mechanical ventilation in COVID-19. Pranav, thanks a lot for that introduction. Next slide. Okay. So to give you a brief idea of what we are dealing with, we are doing a lot of data collection on a day-to-day basis, and this is the situation which we are dealing with actually. So I work in the Greater Manchester region, and this is the data till May of 2020, 29th May 2020, which was published. So we had around 650 patients in our ICU. Not as bad as London and Birmingham, but I think it was the third worst affected region in United Kingdom. So these are the numbers of our admissions of critically ill patients with confirmed COVID-19. Next slide. So just to have a brief overview of our demographics. So the average age or the mean age of confirmed patients admitted to ICU was around 58 years. And if you see all over the world, it was the same, like the male to female ratio was around 3 to 4:1. And if you see the body mass index and other factors, so the patients who were having a BMI above 25 or BMI above 30 had a higher chance of being admitted in our ICU. So these were some risk factors which we identified. Apart from that, it was the BAME community which was constantly mentioned everywhere, the British Asian ethnic minority community, which was the proportion of population of the BAME community which was coming to the ICU was proportionately higher compared to the white population. We still don't know the reasons why that was happening, but it was mentioned everywhere that the BAME community was at a higher risk compared to the general population. So this is some data till the May of 2020, what we saw in our ICU. Next slide, please. So if you see the percentage of patients who received advanced respiratory support coming to ICU was quite high. It was 72% of our patients received advanced respiratory support. Now, what is advanced respiratory support? Anybody who is ventilated is considered as an invasively ventilated is considered as an advanced respiratory support. If you consider basic respiratory support, it's just like what Aviral spoke about, high flow nasal cannula, CPAP, NIV, non-rebreather mask, all that comes under basic respiratory support. So 72% of our patients in ICU were actually invasively ventilated. And if you see the cardiovascular support also, so again, the basic cardiovascular support is just being on one vasopressor like NORAD. Or if the patient is on multiple vasopressors, or if the patient is on IABP or any sort of cardiac output monitoring device, we used to consider it as an advanced cardiovascular support. So patients who were on advanced cardiovascular support was around 28.5%. And the proportion of AKI in our population is worth noting. So in Italy and in the entire Europe, I think they saw around 10 to 15% of patients who required renal support. But in UK, it was considered to be around 25%. So 25% of our patients in ICU actually required some sort of renal support, which is considerably higher than the population of the rest of the Europe, sorry. Next slide, please. So this is just to show that what percentage of our patients who received advanced respiratory support actually died. So this is really sad if we see around 50% mortality in patients who were intubated in the ICU population on versus only 80%, only 19% mortality in patients who receive basic respiratory support. So if you are intubated in ICU, there's a 50% chance of mortality. And also, if you see, I have highlighted that the patients who received advanced respiratory support were highly likely to reach some kind of advanced cardiovascular support, like maybe being on IABP or on cardiac output monitoring, maybe on 2 vasopressors. And also those were the patients who had higher chances of developing AKI and requiring some sort of renal support. So if you are intubated in ICU, there's a 30% chance that you will have AKI, and there is a 39% chance that you will require some kind of advanced cardiovascular support. So these are just our statistics till the May of 2020. I'm not generalizing it to the world. This was just the England statistics, what it showed till the May of 2020 in this pandemic time. Next slide, please. So again, the last slide, basically just to show that more the age of the patient, this is fairly clear, isn't it? Like if the more the age of the patient, more chance that they will die in intensive care. If a patient is above 60, the mortality rate was around 60%. And that actually helped us in making a lot of decisions in whom to admit to ICU and whom not to admit to ICU. If you are above 80 and there is an 80% of chance that if you are being intubated that you're going to die, there's no point of offering mechanical ventilation and intubation to such group of patients. You have to think in a resource limited settings that you have only this much number of ventilators and you're going to judiciously use them to the right number of patients who have a potential reversible chance or a fair chance of recovery. And if you look at the BMI again, if the patients had a higher BMI above 25, they had around 55% of mortality of the 55% chance of being dying in ICU. That was also pretty sad. So again, so all this data actually helped us in making our decisions, deciding our ceiling of care, deciding on whom to bring to ICU, whom to ventilate, whom not to ventilate, and these things basically. It helps a lot in decision making as well. Next slide, Pranav. So as Aviral spoke about these things, I'm going to quickly go over these things. So we know basically there are two phenotypes, the phenotype L and the phenotype H, which was described by Gattinini and colleagues. So in the phenotype L, the only problem is that the problem is in the vasculature. So there is impairment of pulmonary blood flow and there is loss of hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. And the numerous literature, everything is showing that we have COVID-19 is like a pro-thrombotic state. So there is a lot of chance of pulmonary microvascular thrombus formation. Now, why is it so important to differentiate between these two phenotypes? Why do we have to say that this is L phenotype, this is H phenotype? Because our management is going to be so different in both the phenotypes. If you ventilate the patients with phenotype L with higher PEEP, higher recruitment, all those maneuvers which we normally use for ARDS patients, it is going to cause a lot of lung injury and transition of the phenotype L into phenotype H, which is going to worsen the prognosis of the patient. So it is very important to actually distinguish between the L and the H phenotype so that to know which of them will respond to proning, which will respond to PEEP, which will respond to recruitability, so that we do not aggravate the lung injury and make the outcome worse. Next slide, please. So if you look radiologically also, the L and H phenotypes are actually quite different. Like these two patients, their PF ratio was the same. Their FiO2 requirement was around 60 to 65%, but their X-rays look so much different. Like the L-type X-ray, you see some peripheral ground glassing, but nothing more than that. But if you see the H-type, there's so much of consolidation and there is so much of ground glassing, there's so much of opacities. So it is the radiologically, it was these two were positive for COVID-19, but they were radiologically so different and clinically also they were behaving quite differently. Next slide. So this was the CT findings of the L-type and the H-type of ARDS, which we saw. In the L-type, we saw some peripheral ground glassing, some crazy paving patterns, but not much. But in H-type, you'll see this florid type of picture of so much of consolidation, exudates and all that. So it's really important to differentiate between these two phenotypes so that we know what strategies to use in each of them. And also the L type. So majority of your patients will definitely present with your L type. So that's what we saw here, that majority of our patients presented with the L type phenotype, and some of them over the disease progress converted to H type, but majority of them just recovered from the L type as well. So we saw both types of pictures here. Next slide. So what did we do basically? So this is our protocol. So some things actually helped us a lot. For instance, like there was a fast bleep system. So if in the ward anybody, we had COVID wards which did oxygen through non-rebreather mask, and sometimes they used high flow in certain wards, but not in all the wards. So if patient is not maintaining their SATs above 90% and their FiO2 requirement has gone above 60%, our fast bleep used to get activated and we were called to the ward to assess the patient. So when we assess the patient, we used to assess the work of breathing. So the work of breathing, so of course, before that, we'll see if there is any ceiling for escalation. I'll speak about ceiling of care. We do a lot of ceiling of care here, depending upon the frailty score of a patient. If a patient is clinically really frail, if they are advanced COPD, if they are uh, a child pug more than 7, or any sort of severe medical comorbidities, we generally put a ceiling of care, especially in a condition of a pandemic where the number of ICU beds are so less and number of ventilators are so less that you have to reserve from them for the right kind of population. So if there is no ceiling of care, then we used to uh, consider them for admission in ICU. Once they are in ICU, we assess their work of breathing. That if the work of breathing is low, then we can continue with a non-invasive mode of ventilation, which Avril spoke about, like CPAP or NIV or high flow nasal cannula. We did a lot of CPAP hood also. So that somehow helped a lot in some patients who, because wearing a tight mask for such a long period of time and trying to self-prone, it's really challenging for some patients. So the hood actually worked pretty well in some patients. So if the work of breathing is low, then keep a close watch and continue with CPAP and NIV. But if the work of breathing was high, then we used to consider invasive mechanical ventilation. Now, something which helped us again was our policy that we had an intubation team, which was at fast bleep. So this is how you actually rationalize your PPE. You need an enhanced PPE for intubation because it's extremely aerosol generating. So we had an anesthetist consultant as an anesthetist registrar on call for 12 hours shifts, who were carrying these fast bleeps, and they will respond to the fast bleep the moment anybody has to get intubated all over the hospital. So it actually helped us a lot in saving our PPE. So we used to fast bleep the anesthetist, but not in ICU. In ICU, it was taken care of by the critical care people only. So intubate the patients. Avril has already spoken about the precautions need to be taken. So for us, if I have to specify anything, we always use the video laryngoscope, the McGrath video laryngoscope, because that helps in increasing your distance from the exposure slightly. Always the most experienced person used to intubate, and because the first attempt has to be the best attempt, and minimize the number of people who are in the room. That's all. So these are some precautions which was taken. So after the patient is put on mechanical ventilation, we started with lung protective ventilation. We started with volume control mode. So this was our standard volume control mode because it is high. It's very helpful in determining the driving pressures and all that. So started with tidal volume of 8 ml per kg, not 6 ml per kg for everyone. I'll tell you why. And PEEP of 8, and respiratory rate just adjust according to the EtCO2. So the targets of mechanical ventilation were pretty clear, like targeting saturation of 90%, PO2 above 8, that will be around 60 to 70 millimeters of mercury. Sorry for my kilopascal. And then PCO2 will be less than 6, target pH above 7.30, and P-plat less than 28 for lung protective ventilation. So then calculate the driving pressure. What is the driving pressure? Driving pressure is plateau pressure minus PEEP. So how do we see the plateau pressure? If you're on a volume control mode, just press inspiratory hold, you'll see the plateau pressure. So plateau pressure minus PEEP will be your driving pressure. If your driving pressure is less than 15, then obviously, this is not an ARDS type of lung. You can keep your tidal volume at 8 ml per kg because this is a lung with a normal compliance. So, and if you ventilate them with super low tidal volumes, there's a chance of inducing atelectasis, and we don't want to do that. So basically, if your driving pressure is less than 15, just continue with 8 ml per kg of body weight. And if it is less than 15, then reduce it to 6 ml per kg. Next slide, please. Yeah. So just to explain what Avril has already explained, that if spontaneously breathing patients can actually injure their own lungs by having an increased respiratory drive, taking large tidal volume. So it is very important to intubate at the right period of time to avoid this spontaneous breathing induced lung injury, to avoid this phenotype transitioning. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is what I was talking about, that 8 ml per kg of tidal volume, PEEP of 8, calculate the driving pressures. If it is less than 15, then continue with 8 ml per kg. If it is not, then reduce to 6 ml per kg. Next slide, please. So if you start your patient on invasive mechanical ventilation, some patients just improved with that. But if they did not, if their saturation is still less than 90 and their FiO2 is more than 70%, then we paralyze most of our patients. We used cisatracurium, atracurium infusions to paralyze our patients. And the next will be PEEP titration. So everybody has a different method of titrating the PEEP. What we use is by compliance method, that the PEEP at which your compliance is the best will be the optimum PEEP for you. But a lot of people go by decremental PEEP method, by increasing the PEEP to 20 and then slowly coming down and watching the saturation. So the PEEP at which your saturation is the best will be the optimum PEEP. So we went by the compliance method. So find the optimum PEEP of the patient, continue with neuromuscular blockage for at least initial 24 to 48 hours. And then if still your saturation is not 90% and your FiO2 is more than 0.7, then again see the compliance of the patient. If the compliance is more than 40 or less than 40, then again your phenotypes come into picture here. If the compliance is more than 40, then it is clearly the L type, and if it is less than 40, it's clearly the H type. So how will the management differ from here? I'll tell you about it in the next slide. So if the compliance is more than 40, then the patient is actually your L-type phenotype. So what will work in this? So if neuromuscular blockage has not worked, optimum PEEP has not worked, then we can definitely try prone position. So prone position works in both the phenotypes, because the main thing which is achieved with prone position is better VQ matching. So there's a lot of VQ mismatch because of pulmonary circulation problem, microvascular thrombus problem, loss of hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, impairment of pulmonary blood flow. So many of those issues can actually be solved with prone positioning, and prone positioning works beautifully well. Especially in COVID-19, we have had a great experience with proning. It works wonders in both the phenotypes, the phenotype H and L as well. So if it is a phenotype L and prone position works, then well and good. Along with that, we tried inhaled nitric oxide in many of these patients, and it actually worked really well. Because I think the main problem was the loss of the impairment of pulmonary blood flow. So somehow it actually helped in making the pulmonary perfusion better. So inhaled nitric oxide actually worked a lot better. And in some patients, we also tried the iloprost infusion, and it worked really well. So this is out of my experience and some cumulative experience in UK I'm speaking about, that in our centers, prone positioning, inhaled nitric oxide and iloprost had some promising results in L type of ARDS. If you talk about H type of ARDS, so after not responding to high PEEP, we tried recruitment maneuver. Everybody has their own way of recruiting. What we did is we tried CPAP 30 to 35 for 30 seconds. You would have heard of that method. It worked. Sometimes we tried the decremental PEEP method. for recruitment. So whichever suits you, try a recruitment method. If the patient is responding to recruitment, that gives you an additional evidence that they are the H type and not the L type. And what worked in these patients is APRV. So we had some experience with APRV before also. So, but if you don't have an experience with APRV, this is a very good time to learn about APRV. It's a very good mode of ventilation, and definitely it worked in these patients, in especially the H subtypes, because it's a good method of recruitment. It is a good method of oxygenation, and it worked brilliantly. And of course, H type also responds to proning. So these were the some therapeutic options which worked in the L type and the H type. Next slide, please. So APRV, I'll speak briefly about what is APRV. So APRV, full form airway pressure release ventilation. What is it actually? It is a lung protective ventilation strategy, definitely, but it's an open lung approach. What is an open lung approach? Basically, you can spontaneously breathe in, and this spontaneous breathing will be independent of whatever your ventilator is doing. It has nothing to do with the ventilator. The spontaneous breathing will go on and the ventilator will do its work simultaneously. So in APRV, there are two pressures mainly. So it is basically your P high and P low, but you spend most of your time in P high. And that is why your mean airway pressure increases. And with that, you achieve better levels of oxygenation. So you apply P high for a long time, that is your T high, to maintain your lung volume and alveolar recruitment, with a time cycled release phase to P low in a very short time, that is your T low. Next slide, please. So basically, what all are you setting here? You're setting a P high, you're setting a P low, you're setting a T high, and you're setting a T low. I'll tell you briefly how we used to set it. Everybody has a different ways. So our patients were usually on a volume control mode, as I said. So when you're on a volume control mode, your plateau pressure can become your P high. But if you're using a pressure control mode, then I think your peak pressure becomes your P high. So we used a volume control mode. So our P high was usually our plateau pressure. And what was our P low? P low was always 0. And what was our T high? So T high will be around 4 to 6 seconds, but to be safe, we used to start everybody at around 5 seconds of T high. So this is how you set your P high, P low, T high. The only thing which is left is T low, which is a bit complicated. I'll tell you about it in the next slide. So for T low, for the Draeger ventilators, you can automatically actually derive your T low. So how do you derive your T low? You do basically an expiratory maneuver. You basically do an auto release feature. So when you do an auto release feature, the ventilator calculates a T low for you. So the T low will be basically it is calculated on the basis of the fact that where your expiratory flow is getting terminated at 75% of your peak expiratory flow rate. To explain, if your peak expiratory flow rate is around 60, then your expiratory flow will be terminated at 75% of 60, that will be your 45 liters per minute, and T low will be calculated to be around 0.5. But surprisingly, we also use 0.5 as T low as a starting point for majority of our patients, and it worked well. So this is how we started with our APRV settings. And APRV was actually a very, I would say it was a good method of ventilation for recruitment, for oxygenation in this pandemic, especially for the H type of phenotype. It worked really well. Not all the patients were responding to APRV, but if they are not responding to APRV, we can try proning, or you can try proning earlier, or you can try proning and APRV together. I mean, it doesn't matter. Next slide, please. So basically proning, so prone position as usual, it works well. It works in both the phenotypes. It is a great It's a great maneuver. Definitely proning is a great equalizer. So what we did was we made proning teams to reduce the burden on the staff and on the workload. There were 5 people in a shift who were exclusively dedicated to proning only, because I think we were proning around 15 people in one shift and we used to get exhausted. So I think that was a great idea to just make a proning team for 6 hours, that you will only prone for 6 hours a day and do nothing else. So that was a great way of saving energy and channelizing workforce. So we had intubation teams, we had proning teams that actually helped a lot. So how does proning work? Avril has already spoken about it, that it makes your VQ mismatch better. So whichever was the dependent part of the lungs, which is at the lung bases, which are actually collapsed, are getting the best perfusion also. So when you prone them, you open them slightly to, open the lungs to ventilate them better, and also the perfusion in that area improves slightly. So overall the VQ mismatch improves greatly. And of course there are other factors also which help in proning, because you're removing the weight of the abdominal pincers and the heart from the lungs, so they are able to, the lungs is able to breathe better. So proning works in a lot of ways, and I would definitely say consider making teams for proning, because if everybody gets involved in proning, it's just going to make you tired. So prone position definitely worked. Early proning definitely worked. So prone as soon as you can. So, and sometimes we used to prone immediately as soon as we intubated and realized that the patient did not respond to intubation and the FiO2 requirement was more than 60%. So a criteria for proning is any patient with moderately severe ARDS with a PF ratio more than 150 millimeters of, less than 150 millimeters of mercury, and FiO2 less than more than 60%, prone them. No doubt, just prone them. So what helped prolong pronings? Prone more than 16 hours, sometimes 20 hours, 24 hours, doesn't matter. Prone them for a long period of time. Prone them multiple times. So we used to prone them for 16 to 20 hours, then supine them, give them 4-5 hours. If they start deteriorating, then prone them again. We have seen patients who got prone for 20 times and then improved. We have seen prolonged proning sessions, number of proning sessions, more than 10 proning sessions, 15 proning sessions, kept on proning, but they worked finally. Be patient. It's going to take time, but it will work. Keep working towards them. The mean duration of mechanical ventilation is 15 to 20 days. You'll at least prone 10 times in that, but keep proning, it will definitely work. Next slide, please. So if all this doesn't work, it happened, APRV didn't work, proning didn't work, then we had an ECMO service. The ECMO service is at Wythenshawe Hospital, which is 6 miles from our hospital. We have an online referral form for them. We used to fill the form and they used to call us and come and retrieve our patients for ECMO. So what was our strategies for referral for ECMO? Next slide, please. So these are the main things which were to be considered. Is the pathology actually reversible? I mean, there's no point in putting someone on ECMO if their pathology is irreversible. Is the mechanical ventilation injurious? That is, you're not able to achieve plateau pressure less than 30 and you're not able to achieve lung protective ventilation, then definitely consider ECMO. Is the frailty score less than 4? I mean, I'll talk about what frailty score is. A big thing here. We follow frailty score. It's a subjective score, so we follow it for everybody. Duration of mechanical ventilation is less than 7 days, preferably, definitely. And refractory hypoxemia, that despite of trying proning, despite of trying APRV, if your PF ratio is still less than 100, if you have refractory respiratory acidosis, or if you're not able to achieve lung protective ventilation, definitely ECMO is the next step. Next slide, please. So what's a frailty score? This is basically a frailty score. You can give it a read. So 4 is basically a person who will be able to do most of his activities of daily living and usually don't complain of any symptoms, but the only common complaint will be like being slowed up. So the preferred patients for ECMO will definitely be very fit, well, and managing well with a frailty score of 1, 2, and 3. So we definitely did not refer anybody who had a frailty score more than 4. They are just going to say no for ECMO. So this is our clinical frailty score, which we use for majority of the patients. Especially during the pandemic, it has become very important because we have to judiciously give each and every ICU bed and ventilator to patients who are actually going to recover. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, just to share two very interesting cases which actually got referred for ECMO and got accepted by the ECMO team as well. The first patient was actually a police officer, very muscular, very physically active, doing heavy weights. He just had 3 days of presentation of severe acute type of respiratory failure symptoms, shortness of breath. When he presented to our A&E research, his ejection fraction was around 45% and his FiO2 requirement was 40%. But because he was young and physically active and he had a potential of deterioration, we took him to ICU. Within 12 hours, his FiO2 requirement increased from 40% to close to 80%. He got intubated. When we did an echo, his ejection fraction was only 15%. The heart was barely moving. So the right side, the left side, both were like barely moving. So we made a referral quickly, and for young patients who have a pretty good baseline, the ECMO team is very, very prompt in taking them. They'll create beds if they don't have beds also, because these are the actual patients we need to invest on, isn't it? So he went on VA ECMO, followed by which he required actually biventricular assist device also. We heard that he's doing well. He's being slowly, his cardiac support is being weaned off. But that was a very interesting case actually we came across. He also had cytokine release syndrome. His ferritin levels were high, his CRP was high. We don't do IL-6, we do a lot of other surrogate markers like LDH, ferritin, AST, so all those were high. His HLH score was really high. So he got a dose of immunomodulator therapy, tocilizumab as well, and he went on VA ECMO and he's recovering well. The second is, so basically, if you look at his CT scan, he presented like an L-type, but he had COVID myocarditis, which was quite severe. His ejection fraction dropped from 45% to 15% in less than 12 hours, which was pretty acute and pretty scary. So there was a success story there. The second patient actually, another interesting case, she's actually a gynecologist in one of our hospitals. So 40-year-old lady who background of mitral stenosis and rheumatic heart disease. So she presented with 2 days history of shortness of breath and fever. And she got admitted to ICU because her FiO2 requirements were increasing. She got intubated, but her ferritin level came out to be 25,000 and her SHLS score was 189, which is extremely high. As soon as she was intubated, she was proned, did not respond to proning, but again, young lady, good background, no comorbidities, excellent candidate for ECMO, got selected for VV ECMO, and now she's discharged home, is what we heard last. So these are the two interesting cases whom we referred for VA and VV ECMO and who got accepted as well, and both recovered quite well. With this, I think I'll end my presentation. I hope there's no other slide here. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mishra. That was indeed really interesting. It's always great to hear from around the world and how things have been done there, and learning about the phenotypes and the mechanisms of the protocols for ventilation that you follow was really interesting. Up next, we'll be moving on to Dr. Arpan Chakrabarti. He's an eminent practicing cardiac anesthesiologist. He is the present president of the ECMO Society of India and has done some pioneering work with ECMO in Eastern India and has been instrumental in spreading its awareness amongst general practitioners. We're all extremely excited to hear about the ECMO experience at Medica. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Hi, this is Dr. Arpan. I think everybody is audible. So,
Yes, sir.
yeah, Pranav, can I start? Yes, fine.
No, sir, all yours.
Yeah, thank you. So, just look at my first slide, please. ECMO is a team game, and it's a team sport, and that team contains almost a lot number of people, starting from us like cardiac critical care specialists, cardiac surgeons, perfusionists, they're the backbone, nursing staff, the patient, and the patient relatives. So this consists your ECMO team. And I have been given the chance because I have a big mustache and I can speak a bit louder. That's why I have been chosen. So this is my degrees. But I was the last year I was the past president of this thing, ECMO Society of India. I've tried to do some work on ECMO awareness. Probably this is going to give some life and back to their near and dear ones in this part of the world. So with my next things, every talk needs a disclaimer. So I think this is the best thing I got from the Facebook post today. I was waiting when I can omit my mask. So they told during webinar, we need not require a mask. So it's not my thing. You can check from the Facebook. And it is a time to wash your hands. Everybody please do that. Let's, we'll go for 8 to 10 minutes talk after that. So, Medica Super Specialty Hospital, we started our ECMO program in 2014. Started with baby steps, and now this is the 6th year of our program. And we are just 2 cases short for completing our 100 cases of ECMO. And you can find us in the ELSO map, which has been published by ECMO Availability Center map, where we will get our Medica as a center for COVID ECMO and other ECMO programs. And we'll get our names over there. This is the Medica hospital. So what is ECMO? I think Monalisha Mishra has told, and Viral is also told something about ECMO. So it's nothing but it's extracorporeal membrane oxygenation by the use of extracorporeal. ECMO is always outside the body, and it is supporting the circulation. It supports the heart and the lungs to provide a temporary life support. So ECMO is always temporary. It cannot be permanent. And to patients with a reversible. All the red lines are important. It's extracorporeal. It's outside the body. It's temporary. It supports heart and lungs both, and it has to be a reversible phenomenon. So you need to know some horoscope about your patient so that this disease is reversible or not. Like Dr. Mishra told, you can't be putting on ECMO in such patients where they can't come out, but it is not easy to predict always. We have some pro scores. We do check frailties, but they are not very much foolproof. So what we do actually, we do very basic things. We chase the oxygen and carbon dioxide. We take out the black or blue blood from the body by putting big pipes and pass them through oxygenator, which is the lungs outside the body. And that red blood, that oxygenated blood, and the decarboxylation done on that part of the oxygenator, we pump in through another bigger cannula, which is the heart of the ECMO, and thus the patient get oxygenated and the decarboxylated. So this is the nutshell. And if you take out the blood from vein and you push that same oxygenated blood again to the vein, that is known as VV ECMO, venovenous, which is commonly used, and 95% of the usage of this ECMO in COVID pandemic is VV ECMO. And if you take out the blood, like the first case Dr. Mishra told, in a 37-year-old, 50% ejection fraction heart is not working with the myocarditis, you take out the blood from the vein and you oxygenate it and you pump inside the artery, it is known as veno-arterial ECMO. So these are the two broad headings we follow. And obviously, there is a very well-known slide which shows ECMO and ECOR, which is again the carbon dioxide removal, is a well-known treatment from 2012. This intensive care medicine to treat the ARDS when everything fails. So, and this is the statement from the ELSA Society, which is our mother society. They published a consensus document from an international group of interdisciplinary ECMO providers, and which I was a part of it, and we published it a couple of months ago, and which become popular, and we follow all the thing written over there in current pandemic, the ECMO usage in pandemic. So what they have told, this circle shows everything. You have an outer circle with adequate personnel, equipment, the machine has to be available, with the facilities of oxygen on other renal replacement therapies like this. You have systems and you have ethics also. I will come to the ethics part. And then you have to ensure the patient safety, ensure the staff safety, and the quality also. Then you can maximize the benefit of ECMO in the pandemic. So we have divided our hospital utilization or capacity in 4 groups. Like at any point of time, not in pandemic, you are in a conventional capacity. That is, the system is running within the capacity. You have 300 beds, it's running well, no ICU surge of patients. So you can do whatever you want. You can offer veno-venous, you can offer veno-arterial, you can offer ECMO in selected patients based on usual criteria, and you can do the ECMO CPR in that case. But when at the start of the pandemic, right now we are in the contingency capacity tier 1, where you see we have expanded the capacity and we are triaging some patients, because a lot of calls are coming from different hospitals and within the hospitals also, to maximize the resource benefit ratio. Because in ECMO, you have to understand, this is a very resource intensive and the manpower intensive program. It's heavy, and so VV and VA you can offer to younger age group. You have to triage, and you can use judiciously in COVID-19 indications, but eCPR is not offered. The third one is when your expanded capacity also came down to a saturation. What you do then, you prioritize and you restrict ECMO usage, like VV ECMO in younger age group and in the single organ failure in COVID-19 patients, but no veno-arterial or eCPR is offered. And the last one is the crisis capacity, where everything is full, your manpower is done, and capacity is overwhelmed, and ECMO is not feasible in both COVID-19 and non-COVID-19 patients. Currently, we are in the contingency capacity tier 1. I think we will try to keep restricted at that. Yeah, we can avoid some ICU surge things. And this is again that article shows how to manage the ECMO patients on COVID-19 patients on ECMO, starting this kind of headings like respiratory, ultrasonography with radiology things. You use therapeutics, like some therapies you can give some steroids. Now the recovery trial came out where you can give some cytokine removal systems like cytosorbs, or some hematological issues because the patients are very much prone to thrombosis and bleeding. So the threshold of your transfusion goes down. And gastrointestinal, you have to avoid some prokinetic drugs because you are currently on HCQS or azithromycin, that can lead to a QRS prolongation, QT prolongation, that can lead to arrhythmias. ECMO monitoring has to be standardized because once a time when now we are running almost 3 ECMOs at a stretch. So ECMO monitoring has to be minimal with the keeping the eye on the safety. And so your allocation of staff, your allocation of your ECMO specialist, ECMO nurses has to be 1:1. But if you try, you can come down to 2:1 with the utmost care on your safety of your patient and safety of your staff. And the procedures, what you used to do in other ECMO patients like bronchoscopy tracheostomy, that has to be bit in a safe environment. You have to do bronchoscopy, we avoid, and tracheostomy you have to do. You can't get away with this. So you just come down, you just increase the day of tracheostomy, because we do tracheostomy on ECMO very early on 3rd, 4th day. But we have tried, came down to 7th, 8th, or 9th day, just to reduce the viral load, so that this aerosol generating procedures doesn't harm us much. And also the mobilization on ECMO, this also has been put on hold because of manpower. It's already a resource intensive, so mobilization on ECMO is not that we encourage in COVID-19. But obviously the physiotherapy and the chest and lung physiotherapy has to go on. So these are the this consensus data we follow in our institute. And I want to request all of you to read all the lines. I know this slide is a bit clumsy and it can't do, but this is regarding the safety of the staff, because without the staff, without the nursing staff, without the healthcare worker staff, you can't run. Forget about the ECMO, even can't run at the hospital. So you have to go through this stuff, that COVID-19 patients were cohorted in a place, and you have to stick to that. So what happened, where we normally do ECMO, now we're doing ECMO in a different place, in a remote place. So you have to accept that, because you can't mingle the patients who are COVID with the non-COVID patients. That has to be kept in mind. ECMO patients should be managed in negative pressure isolation when available, but this negative pressure isolation rooms are limited. So you have to keep in mind, you have to manage them in the cohorted place. So all laboratory samples of body fluids taken from the ECMO patients, testing should be handled carefully. Blood, the secretions, the oral secretions, the nasal secretions, and also you have to have a policy for the handling of your diseased patients. Also, every center should have a protocol that we are following, that interim consensus guidelines. Effective two-way communications like walkie-talkies or some cameras we use, which is a remote facility of looking at your patients. All non-disposable components of the circuit, that has to be kept in mind, that properly disinfected, because ECMO has two components. One is your disposable component, that is the circuits, and another is a non-disposable components like the console. So you have to disinfect the non-disposable component very carefully. Routine exhaust gas scavenging, what we were telling before, that we have to put a viral filter at the gas scavenging, but we are not recommending that, because there is no suspicion of viral shedding through that. And if you have a plasma leak or another damage to the oxygenator, you need to be careful, and position of the circuit so that to be kept so that it can be seen from a distant site. And also you have to, when you are performing cannulation and the decannulation, it has to be in a very well controlled way by the experts, and on the avoid transfer them. It has to be at the bedside, at the cohorted place, and avoid transfer to your catheterization lab. So this slide you have to go through always. So now I think indications, Dr. Mishra told everything, this veno-venous and VA. We have kept our indications like PF ratio is less than 0.6. Even after the first proning, second proning, up to second proning we wait. But sometimes the prone responders, they respond, and if they don't respond on proning, if your PF ratio is less than 0.6 and you have a PCO2 of more than 80, we started counseling for your ECMO initiation. So that part is there for the indications where the patients are put on ECMO and Medica. And this slide is important because ECMO program is running for 6 years, but not, this is a new disease for last 4 months, and how it is different in COVID. We have to see all the points that are important, like adequate resource and technique utilization before ECMO. ECMO is resource intensive, so you have to exhaust all your techniques before putting on ECMO, starting from this oxygen, from the non-invasive ventilation, from the ventilation, from the proning, till all this, all exhausted, and then the patients are put on ECMO. Second is ECMO in the cohorted place. I told you before that there is a cohorted place, there is an isolation areas where it's been made. You have to perform ECMO over there. Third is the utmost staff safety. You have to ensure your staff safety. That is your mandatory. Even if you don't run your ECMO program, you have to safely handle your staffs. You have to have a facility of remote monitoring, like camera in like EICU. All the aerosol generating procedures like bronchoscopy, tracheostomy has to be carefully handled. Handling of membranes. Here I have today membranes of like oxygenators, dialysis membranes. We have to handle carefully. Decannulation, which is considered to be a very you are in a joy when the patient comes out, or you are very grief when the patient is not coming out. Both cases, the decannulation is as important as the cannulation. I'll show you some pictures where you decannulate. We take the full PPE, and you have some ethics in the pandemic. Plan for futility, because ethics comes to us in the practice in two types. Like one is the distribution ethics, like you have two patients, which one is age of 63 and one is of 40 years. You have one ECMO machine, and to whom you have to give. Then you have to score it. You have to triage them. Who has this multi-organ failure? He will not to be put on ECMO. Who has a maximum chance will be put on ECMO. So this distribution ethics you have to constantly run, because the number of machines are low as required as in pandemic. And the second thing is the futility. If you find that after putting on ECMO, patient had a cerebral bleed, or patient is having a multi-organ failure, or the patient is not doing that well, and your next patient is waiting for your ECMO, which is a likelihood of survival. So you can ask for a early futility to your relatives. You can explain them that this is a pandemic and you have a limited resource. You can put ECMO in the next patient. Last one is a very much practical problem. Whatever you do in a ventilated patients, in the ECMO patients, you won't find their relatives, you won't find their near and dear ones. So all the consents, all the necessary communication in WhatsApp, in video calls, through mails, you have to continue. And you also it has to be done multiple times, so that the near and dear ones who are in the quarantine center, who are in the at home, their home quarantine, they should not feel that their near and dear ones are in trouble and we are not looking after them adequately. So this is my take on how ECMO is different in our COVID scenario. And so this is the last part of our things. COVID ECMO in Medica, we did 6 cases till now. Obviously, like other parts of the world, we have 5 respiratory, 1 VA, and out of that 5 respiratories, 4 cases were the femorojugular approach with the VV, 1 case of femoral, and 1 case of femoral venoarterial with the 7th French distal perfusion. And we kept a mean high flow very high, 4.5 liters per minute. For as evident in other studies also. And this is our because we have only 6 patients on ECMO, so we just made some chart for this. So we have a this ventilation to ECMO time is mean is 32 hours. So obviously this I told you that after the first or second proning, most of the time the ECMO has been offered. Mean PF ratio is 0.6, which is very much accepted. Proning before ECMO, only 1 patient didn't receive proning, and 80% patient received proning before ECMO has been offered. Renal replacement therapy, so pretty high, 40%. And I'll show the myocarditis happened in 1 patient, which is 20%. Shock liver in 1 patient. Cerebral issues are quite common, is as high as 40%. Circuit thrombosis, luckily, touch wood, and bless us that we have not experienced any circuit thrombosis, because in Chinese study there are huge number of circuit thrombosis they have faced, and in Europe, though less than the China and the North America, they have faced less circuit thrombosis, but not that many. We have touch wood not yet faced that circuit thrombosis issue, and we have this bleeding and DIC issue in last 20% patients. So I'll show some 5 cases. This is a case 1. That is we did yesterday retrieval by ground transport. We went with this ECMO machine in an ambulance, and this is the picture of my team with me. We are going to that distant hospital, and at that hospital we cannulated him, we stabilized him, and for 1 hour there is a ground time over there. So we are all in PPE. You can't make us out. My moustache is not also seen through that PPE. So I don't leave any here for the picture. So we have to do for the future recording. So it is in the lift of that hospital. So you have to be you see the ECMO machine is between the two legs of your patient. So that is the way of transport we do. And again is at the corridor of that hospital. And we are this patient is going inside the ambulance, and the ECMO machine is between the two legs. You can see the color of the two cannulas. It's going inside. It's going inside. We are coming out. Now we are coming out at Medica. Again, with the same utmost precautions. At least 6 people were required to transport the patient. On PP is very difficult. So that was the patient. He's doing well till now. Let's see. Just 24 hours happened. The second case is very similar to what Dr. Mishra told. He's a 40-year-old guy. He came with a pneumonia with myocarditis. We cannulated him, and that is his heart actually. He had a biventricular dysfunction with the ejection fraction of around 25%. With the RV is very dilated, and this was the measurements we took, and we are doing this after this cannulations. We did the echo, and this was the LV, which got dilated, and it's almost 5.5 centimeter. But he improved. This is a cannula at the IVC. IVC is full. You can see, and after that he got improved with that, and he got discharged. We did trachea on day 8 and ECMO decannulation on day 10, and tracheostomy decannulated on day 22. He went home. This is the case number 3. He's still on ECMO day 9. He's with came with that X-ray, and he got prone, but he didn't. He received 1 dose of tocilizumab, but no improvement. That PF ratio went down below 0.5, and we cannulated him. And there's a position of the cannula. IVC is not that big, and we have a minimum flow of 4.7 liters. And this is the 4th case where we put ECMO on. This is a late ECMO. After the 4th proning we put, he didn't improve. Initially improved after the 1st proning, but on 2nd and 3rd proning he didn't improve. So we put him on ECMO, and you can see that we put him on femoral cannulations. You can see that is the cannulation strategy. But unfortunately, we lost him due to a massive ICH inside the brain, and on day 5. So that is the patient we lost. Case 5 is a 100 kg patient with pneumonia with acute renal failure. On presentation, his creatinine was 4.12. He just proned, and because his pH was not maintaining and hypoxic, we put him on ECMO. And there is the middle of the night. You can see the inside the COVID ICU what happens, and that mark shows saturation is 80, and Aviral told me that pneumonia is of H-type pneumonia, but PF ratio is very low. We put him on ECMO, and that is a cannulation. There is the neck cannula in the right jugular vein, and there is a groin cannula in the right femoral vein, and this is the color difference. Black and the red, and flow almost reaches 500 kgs. We give around 5.82 liters flow, and that was the patient. Saturation maintained throughout, and we started after some times, after 6 days, we started weaning him. Lung got improved. That is that slide I want to show that even on decannulation, you take the whole precautions of your PPE and all this, because that can shed some viruses at that point of decannulation. So be careful about during the decannulation. This is a patient still on ventilator. We are making him sitting. All the physiotherapy, as good physiotherapy, has no alternative to this kind of patients. He's getting mobilized. that slide I want to show that we have we put the viral filter at the scavenging port, but this has been taken out because they have told these membranes and the dialysis membranes also doesn't shed SARS-CoV virus. So this was the picture. SARS-CoV does not spread through ECMO or dialysis membranes. So this is my last slide. I show everybody. I started with Facebook, ended with Facebook. Follow them till follow our ECMO survivors till they are your Facebook friends. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arpan. That was great. We're drawing to a close, but I would request our panelists to check out the question and answer box. If you find any specific questions that you would like to address yourselves, that would be great. I would like to just start with, I would also encourage you to ask questions to each other if there's anything you'd like to know from each other in terms of how things are done in our various setups. I think you're muted, Dr. Aviral.
There,
Yep,
can you hear me now?
Yep.
Wonderful. So I think I'll go first because I started out first. So first, I'd like to thank my co-speakers, Dr. Arpan Chakrabarti and Dr. Monalisa Mishra, for their really outstanding presentations. Thank you, sir, for the outstanding presentations. And yeah, so for a webinar, you don't need a mask, but when you're sitting next to each other, you better do. And he's been decannulating patients, so God knows what's been coming out of them. There's a nice saying which the chairman of our company says: nothing nice comes out of the human body other than words. So anyways, so Dr. Monalisa Mishra, so as a part of your frailty index, I saw that 1, 2, 3, 4, and anybody who's a 4 and above, you do not take on your frailty index. But what about for mechanical ventilation, not just frailty? Are there any other considerations you take before you put a patient on mechanical ventilation? Because if their survival is less than, say, 6 months, 1 year, even if they have, say, stage 2, stage 3 cancer, or are there home oxygen? Some people with oxygen at home are still able to walk around and get work done. So apart from just frailty, are there any other considerations you take before you put your patients on mechanical ventilation?
Thanks for that question. In a pandemic, this question is really, really important. It's a very good question. So we were very strict about whom to ventilate or not, because for the first time in history, we actually saw a shortage of ventilators. So each and every ventilator was precious. Each and every ventilator went to the person who has a chance of recovery. So basically, it was divided on a lot of criteria. So if you go system-wise, if any patient with chronic liver disease with a child pug more than 7, COPD, advanced COPD, patient with chronic heart failure with NYHA 3 or 4, these patients we did not even take to ICU. They were provided supportive treatment outside ICU. So forget putting them on mechanical ventilation. Any end-stage renal disease, they were not for ICU. They were only for level 2 care, that is HDU level care.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Thanks so much, Dr. Monalisa. Because over here at Medica, we have a large ESRD population, and thankfully we have not seen a lot of patients required from that population getting sick to the level where they need ICU. But the question always becomes, when they do become sick, it's like we have, I think, 2 ventilators left in the entire hospital right now. So we are also coming to that situation, and then in a private setup, it's much more difficult to make that distinction as compared to a government mandate which the NHS has.
Yes.
So, but it makes our lives easier in helping to triage. We basically have triage ventilators now.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
So it was basically a government thing, isn't it? So basically, it is like you have to look out for the entire society instead of looking out for an individual. So it was really, we took very tough decisions.
Actually, what happened, the initial part of the pandemic, Raviral knows one of our consultant's mother was got intubated and going to the ARDS, but she was grade 4 CLD, on the list of your hepatic transplant. So we didn't put ECMO on her, and we tried, and we took a good decision, I think, because I think ECMO is not for in pandemic is not for this kind of patients, and you are doing right. But what he told this private setup is not a. We have patients who are catering regularly coming to us, so they got some priorities over there. But now I think we are again a distribution ethics we are maintaining even on the ventilator part, ECMO part. I'm doing that from very beginning.
Thank you, sir. Pranav, are there any questions that from the panelists, from our audience, that you would like to share with us?
Sure. So I think a few of the questions that came in were regarding our rates of recovery in terms of patients who have gone on to the ventilator, who have gone on to ECMO. So we can talk about it from Medica's perspective, and then also from Dr. Mona Lisa Mishra's perspective. Just touch upon that.
So I can talk a little bit about the ventilators here in Medica. So far, we have had about. Do you have the slides from yesterday, Ritwik? If you could just put them up quickly. So while Ritwik gets the slides, from what I know, as of right now, our rate of recovery from ventilator is about 40% recovery, and of those 60% that have not recovered, about 20% or 30% of them are still on the ventilator. So that's a recovery rate on the ventilator. So roughly, if you see all the patients who have discharged home, roughly a mortality rate in that population is around 60 to 65%. But that being said, a majority of our patients are of the older age group. Like I said, we have a lot of end-stage renal disease patients, and what's appearing in our data is we are getting a lot of, because we have a strong gastroenterology setup, we have a lot of patients who have advanced liver disease, and they just do very, very poorly. And because we don't have strict criteria like the NHS does, when they go bad, they usually go on the ventilator. And our experience has been advanced liver disease does very poorly on the ventilator. We're looking at almost 85-90% mortality rate over there. And advanced kidney disease, probably less, 60-75%. Multiple comorbidities in India, like not just one, but if you have diabetes, you have hypertension, they very, very quickly progress to RRT. And once you're on 2 organ failure, our mortality rate is almost 75% there. Otherwise, the rest of our population, the younger, healthy group, if their age is less than 60, the mortality rate over there is only like 25-30% or so.
I can tell about the ECMO, which is till now I told you the show that we did 6 ECMOs till now, and one patient decannulated and went home. Second patient decannulated and is getting out of the ventilator. Third, we lose him because of large ICH. And next 3 patients are still on ECMO. One on day 9, one on day 6, and one just retrieved yesterday, just 24 hours down. So this is our ECMO statistics, and calls are coming for ECMOs. So let's see. I think we can do something better. I think my friend Giokov has a lot of questions in my things. He's very hi Giokov. I think I should give some answers to you. We don't have a negative pressure pressure area where we intubate and all this. Because with a large kind of hospital, always it is not easier to put very large negative pressure areas. But we have some areas that are cohorted as isolated, and we change them to a negative pressure areas. But in the OT, still we are putting the SC off and doing the intubation and all the procedures over there. And what are the other questions? And how many days are you ECMO, and when you say stop ECMO, my patient is responding to treatment? Actually, I have a very good answer to it, because just a day before yesterday, Twitter has given me the answer, because there is in Austria they did post-mortem study on the patients, and they found very little fibrosis. So they told that futility in COVID is not a very to be early told to the patients on ECMO who is dependent on your ECMO. And that's why people are taking the bilateral lung transplant in cases where the news are coming from China, news are coming from Austria, news are coming from North America. They are offering bilateral lung transplants for ECMO. So I think there is no limit till now. But for our things, we say to the patients that 14 days we have to give for the patients on ECMO to at least show some recovery.
Ventilation.
So any more questions? Plasma therapy, we have not done.
The trouble is you can only do it on trial basis, and we are not a trial center for plasma therapy yet in Calcutta. Though plasma therapy is recommended by the government, it's still completely controlled by ICMR and by the government hospitals. So we do not have access to plasma as of right now, unless you're a part of the trial itself. And there's a question on remdesivir, not available in India yet, hopefully soon.
I think the tocilizumab question as well was touched upon during your main presentation. We had good results, I think.
We are getting good results. I think the trick with tocilizumab is it doesn't really work once they're on the ventilator. You use it to keep your patient off the ventilator.
I think remdesivir also,
Same thing with remdesivir, moderate
because
disease.
that trial they did in North America, they have shown the 5 days trial is better than the 10 days trial when you give off the ventilator. So it is also the to prevent the patients who are on ventilator.
Okay, if that's something else, Pranav.
Yes, I thank all of you for joining us, panelists. Thank you so much. It was really nice. I thank all the participants who came in a lot. We have a good turnout. I hope this was as insightful for all of you as it was for me. Until next time, thank you all. Thank you all.
And we will keep updating about our ECMO things because the patients still are on ECMO. So probably the next webinar also, these things will keep updating them.
New updates.
New updates with all this.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.